Let's talk about the ego for a second. Now, the ego gets a bad rap, and to be honest, it's fair. I understand why. I get it. It's something that oftentimes comes up, especially in spirituality, where the ego is the enemy to our greatest good. And again, I understand where this is coming from. However, I am also a believer that all things work for our greatest good. Period. It doesn't matter what it is. The most negative of circumstances or thought processes is going to work for our greatest good so long as we set that intention for ourselves. So let's get into this thing of the ego feeding on your fear. Now, first and foremost, what is the ego? Well, multitude of people probably have a multitude of ideas or definitions, but mine is real simple, straightforward, something that you can take home, something you can explain to your grandmama or the baby at home. The ego is the survival aspect of yourself, or the ego is the survival part of your own psyche, which means the part of you that is completely involved in survival. And so its entire job is to consistently and perpetually remind you of what is going to allow you to survive. Now, the problem with the ego is that it is oftentimes, if not always, wrong because it is completely involved in staying the exact same. It does not want change. It does not want an alteration of its state. It does not want anything to be shifted. It is, it recoils when you're supposed to go forward, right? It goes left when you're actually pulled to go right. It basically works in opposition or in opposites of your spirit. Your spirit is forever expansive. Your spirit is forever calling you into more. Your spirit is forever calling you into adventure, into the unknown, whereas the ego is doing the very opposite at all times. The spirit wants to shed of identity, whereas the ego is looking to always cling onto some sort of identity for its quote-unquote survival need. So the ego is not alone, and the ego has its own source of food, just like, the cells in our body feed off a certain thing, right? Each organ within our body feeds off a certain thing. Our brain feeds off a certain thing. All in nature has its own food source. The trees have their own substance that they feed upon that is uniquely their own. And so does the ego. And what the ego feeds on is this thing we call fear, the energy of fear. Now, fear is something that everybody on this entire known and unknown universe probably has experienced, and we know what it is when we feel it, but in most cases it is difficult to pinpoint or to define, right? Like, that's why we just use the word fear. Oh, I'm in fear, or that is fear. But truly, fear is complex. Fear has a multitude of a root system. Like, if fear was the tree, then it has a multitude of roots. Or fear was an umbrella. This is even better. Fear was an umbrella, then it has a multitude of other things that fall under that umbrella. And those would include worry, concern, doubt, anxiety, etc., right? The list will go on. These are the products of fear. So fear itself doesn't just show up as fear. Fear shows up as doubt in the mind. It shows up as anxiety in the body. It shows up as worry in the brain, right? It shows up in different ways, in different forms of fashion, yet it is still fear, which is why in some cases we even misdiagnose the experiences that we have. In most cases, I hear people saying, I'm not afraid, or I have no fear, when in truth, the things they're doing or not doing are actually ran by fear. They just categorize it as something else, right? It's that survival aspect or survival mechanism. The ego is camouflaging fear as something else. So it may be as rationality, right? As being realistic. Like, those are huge. It has a multitude of ways to justify something in order for us to believe that we're actually not in a state of fear. We're just doing the best thing for our own survival. So if you look at the world on like a grand scale, most of the world is ran by fear. Most of the world is ran by absolute terror, which is why you have, these corporations, let's say, doing one thing, or different systems that have been put in place doing one thing, or people at an individual level doing certain things that are so selfish, that are so against the good of all, and even against their own good in the long term. and in the short term, to be honest, at a spiritual level, but even in the physical, like we will do things to ourselves that are against ourselves and camouflage it in something else. And the aspect of us that is doing that is the ego. And it's, again, it feeds off of fear. It takes fear and transmutes it into its energy source. And so what we have to start understanding is the only way we can actually build up the ego or build up this entity that is so fixated in survival and oftentimes stops us in our tracks when it's time to expand, which is always when it's time to grow, when it's time to let go of the past, when it's time to overcome traumas, when it's time to truly heal. When we are in that space and we know that it's time for us to transcend where we currently are, we have to know that the ego is something we have to let go of. In trying to find the best way to say this, it's not something we destroy, which I used to think. It's not something that we kill. It's not something that we butcher. It's not something that we aggressively attack. It's actually something that we slowly wean off. It's something that you essentially starve. You stop feeding it and it stops gaining power. And so again, the source of fuel or the source of food, the energy source of the ego is fear. And so in order to weaken its defense, in order to weaken its control and its power, we stop giving it fear. Now, this one specifically is something that I've heard far too many times throughout my life to a point where I even believed this was true. But now I've come to realize through life experience, my own experiences, my own livelihood, the way in which I conduct and carry my life is that fear is not an essential aspect of life. You know, we have biologists or scientists abroad, and they would tell us that fear is just a part of the human experience and it's a part that we must accept and it's normal, right? And just because something is normalized and it's widespread doesn't mean it's natural. It doesn't mean that it is truly our default. A baby is born with pretty much no fear, to be honest with you. Like if we really got down to it at the core, a newborn baby has no fear. And you might think, oh, that's naivety, right? That's what we've been trained to think. We've been trained to think that if you don't fear, if you don't have worries or concerns, then you'll jump off a bridge or whatever it is. When in truth, that's not the case, right? That is actually discernment. And when we are in a state of fear, we're actually fixated on worst case scenarios. And if you know how energy moves, our energy shifts, or how we attract, whatever you're fixated on, whatever you're focused on, is actually what tends to occur. Which is why, ironically, if you see like a parent with their child, they'll say to their child, don't fall, right? Or, get off that tree, you're going to fall out that tree. They're actually creating imagery in the child's mind of falling out that tree. So a parent who tells a kid, oh, wow, that's amazing. How did you get up there? Look at that. And they play along with it. Or a parent who simply allows their kid to go through the process of life and doesn't create that imagery, their kid is actually going to be safer and more secure internally than a kid who's always told, don't do that because this is going to happen. There's imagery being created. And so that's not only unique to children, but it's basically all humans. We all have that capacity to store those memories or to store those images in our mind and the emotional experiences, which then manifests as our lives. And so fear is a fixation on a worst case scenario, whereas love is a fixation on the best case scenario, on the highest good. So when we are in a state of fear, we are actually consciously or unconsciously running images in our mind that correlate with emotions of a worst case scenario. And again, we have been taught in a multitude of different ways. Maybe it wasn't a straightforward teaching, but it was definitely an unconscious or subliminal kind of messaging, where it's to say that you must worry about things in order to make sure they get done, right? Whether you're a child and you had a test coming up the next week, you were told to concern yourself with the test. Like most of us weren't taught, hey, relax about it, like chill about it, have fun about it, right? Be easy about it, which is actually a greater determining factor for success, even in things like test taking or the most traditional and rigid type of structures. When you are in a relaxed state, when you are in a chill state, when you are at a peaceful state, you're actually able to create, to innovate. You're able to dig into the spaces within your own memory where you desire in order to get the outcomes that you want, let alone what's actually going on in the spiritual realm, right? So again, Fear is that fixation on the worst case scenario. And the more we feed that fear, the more we are feeding the ego, and the ego is running the show. So when you find an individual who has stopped feeding that aspect of themselves, right? Or started weaning themselves off of fear, just like you would wean yourself off of a drug, or you would go, cold turkey off a drug, whatever it may be. An individual who is staying in a meditative state, who is, going into that place of stillness more and more and more until it becomes their default state. And now peace has become your new norm. When you find an individual like that, you will see that their life is actually working in miraculous ways. You'll see that they move, and everywhere they go, they're in a perfect place, perfect timing, perfect this, perfect that, right? Whereas a person who lives in constant fear seems to always have something to worry about. And the explanation for that is simple. When you are in a fear state, you are fixated on the worst case scenario, and whatever you fixate upon then manifests as your reality. It is that simple, that straightforward. If I am focused on, losing my shoe, and I'm worried about losing my shoe, and I'm concerned about losing my shoe, the odds of me losing my shoe are greater and greater and greater, right? But when I'm chilling about my shoes, I'm happy for my shoes, I'm enjoying my shoes, I'm glad about my shoes, I'm doing my thing. Let's say I misplace them and I don't even worry about it. I'm going about my day, boom, I find them again, right? We are unlocking a part of our unconscious or subconscious mind and accessing parts of that unconscious mind that are always helping us, always for our greatest good, always aiding us in the process. We are always divinely guided when we are in resonance with peace as opposed to in resonance with fear. Again, both of these are choices. And that's a part that I need to hammer home, because again, the programming that we've been inundated with is fear is normal and worry is normal. And, you need to be concerned about things, when in reality, that's actually creating the very opposite of the experiences that you want out of life. So the ego, once you stop feeding on that fear, which is literally making the decision to not feed a thought of fear, not feeding that emotion, which is just a product of the thought, and instead feeding a best case scenario or neutralizing it, right? And probably I'll definitely make a video about surrender, or a few videos, probably get into it on our podcast, The Healing Circle. Shameless plug. But as far as when you come to a state of no longer feeding that fear, right? Which is no longer feeding that ego, which was in control before, you are now feeding the spirit, which is truth. You're now feeding the highest good in your life. You're feeding the part of you that is going to bring about the best case situations, the best case scenarios, the best case interactions. And again, I'm not speaking from a book here, though I've read the Nevilles and the Josephs and the Rev Ikes, etc., and the TDs, all of this. I have saturated myself with this content, but when I let that go and just started living it, I have seen my life bearing these very fruits. Like, I have seen my life from within literally shift, transcend, becoming a different person, experiencing a type of peace I never even thought was possible for a human to experience. And I know there's even greater depths and greater levels and greater layers of that very same peace that I am going to experience, because I am now feeding that aspect of me. Again, this is simply about what you're feeding, and you're feeding through your focus. Make sure you really, truly imprint that on your forehead, on the back of your head, on the side of your heads. You feed through your focus. So if I am on my feed, my Instagram feed, and I'm using air quotes right now if somebody's listening, if I'm on my TikTok feed, I'm actually placing my focus upon something that is creating imagery in my head, that is creating an emotional response, that is attracting specific things to me. So first, it starts off as more thoughts and more emotions that are in resonance with whatever imagery I have going on in my headspace, or in my imagination, right? In my imaging center, imaging nation. That's a whole different lesson right there for a whole different day. So if I'm feeding myself these images or these words that are creating that emotional response, and I continue to do that, I'm actually creating a new belief system. And that belief system is then going to create my external experiences. As a man or as a person thinketh within themselves, so are they, or so will they become. Your being is created and predicated upon the things that you focus upon. So therefore, why would you not fixate on your highest good? Why would you not fixate on the highest ideal? Why would you not fixate on the greatness of life, on the goodness of life? Why would you not focus completely on gratitude, which I believe has been that's one of the greatest gifts from God we have. The word gratitude is broken up into two words, grati and tude, which means free state or free condition, which means a condition of free or a condition of freedom, a state of freedom. So to be grateful is literally to be in a state of freedom. You free yourself each time you're grateful for something, and it makes complete sense. Because if you're complaining, if you're worried, if you're anxious about something, you're narrowed your focus and you feel like you're in bondage. You feel like you're in a box. You feel like you have nowhere that you can go. But when you have gratitude, it opens up your perspective. It opens up your focus and you see the infinite possibilities. You start to see the good. When you focus on one good thing, it turns into two good things, then into four good things, then into eight good things, then into 16. It compounds and compounds, right? Just like if you were to go down a negative spiral in your thoughts, the positive spiral in your thoughts is the exact equivalent, and it will not stop. It feels like a bottomless pit when you're going down. It is a bottomless upward trajectory when you're going up. And so it is our own intentional decision, our own deliberate decision to go upward or to continue downward in that staircase, to feed the ego or to feed the spirit. It is our own decision and our own choice. Are we going to continue to go on the path that is the known path, but has been the destructive path, has been the toxic, has been the path that keeps us constricted, that keeps us bound, that keeps us slaves within our own lives? Or are we going to actually step outside of that space and step into true life, into real life? Are we going to be led by the very thing that is always seeking to guide us to our highest good, which is that spirit that is within? That decision is up to us. That decision is up to us. Again, this is a message I will continue to perpetuate for the rest of my existence here and forevermore. It is our own decision process, which means our own intention, our own will, that allows us to choose to go one direction or another. The same way I'm choosing to pick up this cup and drop it down is the same way I'm choosing to pick up a certain thought, to focus on that thought, and to drop another thought off, right? In most of my videos, I use the example of, like, if I'm holding on to a pen, I can choose to let go of that pen at any moment in time. But if I continue to justify or rationalize why I'm holding on to that pen, it's not going to serve me. If I continue to, make excuses or fight for those limitations as far as why I can't let go of that pen, then my life will continue to be dictated by holding on to that pen. That's just an analogy for your belief systems. When you have a specific set of beliefs that you are justifying, specific set of limiting beliefs that you are continuously feeding, you will find yourself in that very same spiral, in that very same loop, in that very same cyclical life where it seems as if you're living the same experiences over and over, just with different faces. In order to step out of that space, you have to start to feed something new. And it is as simple as feeding something new. It is as simple as dropping one thought off and picking up another thought. And yes, they told you that belief systems are so hard to change and it takes so much time, etc., but truly it takes intention and it takes intensity, which means it takes a true focus, dedication, and a care. And yes, there is persistence, but there's persistence in everything we do in life, right? Even in learning how to hold the pen in the first place, there was persistence. It's not a thing of time, it's a thing of intensity. And so again, it is us making that conscious decision that we are going to feed the good as opposed to feeding that fear. We're going to feed the love, which is the aspiration or the imagery or the feeling of our highest good that would then manifest into that in our physical experience, or we're going to continue to feed the very same thing and have those experiences that are based and rooted in fear.